Greetings, welcome to the Porch sessions, which is produced by the Department of English and Cultural Studies. My name is David Jefferess, and I'm an Associate Professor of English and Cultural Studies at UBC Okanagan, and I'm with Sakiru Adebayo, who's a new Assistant Professor at the university. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are ceded and living in the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Syilx Nation, and that UBC Okanagan is located in this territory. As an uninvited guest, I recognize my responsibilities as a guest in this territory and recognize that the Okanagan Nation continues to assert its obligations as the caretakers of this land, as they have done so since time immemorial. And so I want to start by introducing Adebayo. As I said, Adebayo is a new addition to UBC Okanagan in the Department of English and Cultural Studies. And he's just had his manuscript accepted for publication. So I don't have a book to show you. It's still in process, but it will be coming out soon, and I've had the pleasure of being able to read parts of it, and so I appreciate that, and hope we can have a good conversation about your work. So I'm wondering maybe to begin, if you wanted to just introduce yourself a bit more and tell us a bit about the book.
Thank you very much, David, for first of all agreeing to do this and also reading parts of the book. It's my dissertation that was rewritten, actually revised significantly, and now it's been accepted and it's going to come out hopefully mid next year with the University of Michigan Press. The title of the book is Continuous Past, Frictions of Memory in Postcolonial Africa, and it started as just a question about how. So I read a book when I was in my third year, and a novel titled Half of a Yellow Sun, which is about the Nigerian Civil War that happened between 1967 and 1970. And as a Nigerian undergraduate student, I was very shocked that something like that happened in my country, and I was a third-year university student, and I didn't know about it. And it wasn't only me; a lot of students in my class also didn't know about that history. So we had to go back home to ask our parents what happened between 1967 and 1970, and that led to a whole lot of other questions that haunted me up to my PhD. When I was doing my PhD, or when I started my PhD, so I decided to then study, in Africa, in post-independence Africa. The first country to gain independence in Africa is Ghana, and it gained independence in 1957. And between 1967, when Biafra happened, till even now, a lot of civil wars and conflicts have happened on the continent, and there seems to be a thread that brings all of those conflicts together, in the sense that there seems to be a culture of repression. The state repression is very big in many places, or institutionalized amnesia, or just even traumatic silence, such that a lot of people in those post-conflict countries in Africa do not talk about the war. They don't want to remember it. Maybe in places like Rwanda and South Africa, there is a lot, about remembering going on, but also there is a lot of politics attached to that. So I decided to look at literary works and how they intervene in the face of institutionalized, amnesia or state repression, how literature or fiction, to be specific, becomes a way or an avenue to remember a very difficult past, and sometimes how fiction itself does not only, represent friction of memory, but sometimes also causes friction. So that's how I began to do that research, and so in the book I look at 4 countries, 4 what would be known as post-colonial or post-independence or post-conflict African countries, including Nigeria, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. And in these 4 countries, so the book basically brings memory studies and African studies into dialogue. There is a lot of literature on memory, especially on the Holocaust memory. And I do borrow a little bit from that to see how I borrow some theories and concepts from that to see how it can be applied or not applicable to the African context. And so I look at Nigeria, for example. I look at literature, Afo specifically, because it spoke directly to me. So what it means to write about an event that you did not experience, you don't have a lived experience of. That's Chimamanda Adichie, who wrote Afo. She wasn't born during the war, she was born 7 years after, and then she wrote this very magnificent, fantastic book on Biafra. And so what does it mean to write about something you did not experience? And so I borrow the post-memory theory, which Marian Esch, a scholar at Columbia University, used to study how the children of Holocaust survivors remember. And then I look at how that concept works with the novel in the Nigerian context, and also instances where it doesn't work. And the chapter on Sierra Leone, I look at a Sierra Leonean author by the name Aminata Fona, who has written a lot of novels about the Sierra Leonean Civil War, which again happened between, I think, 1992 and 2004, if I remember correctly. And it was a protracted, prolonged war. And she writes about the war and looks at particularly the culture of silence, because now in post-war Sierra Leone, a lot of people don't talk about the war. And she makes the argument that it's not just about trauma, it's not just about because perpetrators and victims live side by side, but also because silence is woven into the culture, so it's part of the culture. So I look at the novel The Memory of Love as a novel that aesthetically also tries to represent struggles, actually, to represent that silence. In the Rwandan context, people have written a lot about the genocide, and I didn't want to regurgitate what others have written, so I decided to look at the Writing as a Duty to Remember project. So this was a project that was initiated in 1998, 4 years after the genocide, and it was a direct response to the fact that a lot of reports and writings about the genocide were written by Westerners, by outsiders, and so these African writers, about 10 of them, decided to go to, including some Rwandan writers, to go to Kigali in 1998 and just explore the city and write an imaginative response from an African perspective to the genocide. And so I read the whole project itself as some sort of African transnational memory work, but at the same time I look at a book by Veronique Tajo, which was part of the project, part of the book that came out of the project, to examine what it means to write about an event that you did not, you are not, Veronique Tajo is from Ivory Coast, so she's not Rwandan. What does it mean to write about other people's pain and trauma? The last book that I explore the last novel that I explore in the book is by Dinao Mengistu, who is an Ethiopian-American author. So in that chapter, I look at what it means for memory to travel continental borders. Basically, the book is just about, providing different ways of thinking about remembering in post-conflict African context.
Sounds fascinating. I'm struck, you began by highlighting that growing up in Nigeria, you didn't learn about the Biafra War. And I'm struck by the kinds of parallels that I think are probably similar in many different societies, but like certainly in what is currently Canada, it's only very recently that non-Indigenous people have begun to recognize the residential school system. And, you know, and it's like very recent, and for a long time, like for a lot of people, this would be very surprising. Why didn't I learn about this? Why didn't I hear about it?
First of all, I think that memory scholars would tell you that we are in the era of the memory boom. So even while people are starting to reckon with the past in Canada, you see that also conversations about slavery starting to happen in the US and many other places. And I think that it still, you know, connects with that idea of memory boom. But yeah, so for me, when one of the threads that you find in these novels that I analyze in the book is that they make a distinction between you know, the perpetrator's time and the victim's time. So in most cases, the perpetrator of a particular crime, they want to move on, they want to get over it, we want to, yeah, like you said, close the chapter. But then the victims, if you listen to the victim, you realize that their temporality is very different. The past is still very much present with them. So for me, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that the past, if you read all of this post-colonial African narratives, they present us with, you know, they make us see how the past is present in structures of silence, in, you know, migration, in structures of migration, on the body, on the victim's body, or even just in the topography. For example, Adichie, when she did one interview, she said that one of the reasons why she wanted to write about the war was because when she was playing in the playground, she'll see rusty ammunitions and she, at that time, she didn't know that those ammunitions were from the war. So even the environment tells a story about the past. So everywhere the victim sees, you know, traces of the past, but sometimes the perpetrator, you know, is just oblivious to that. But then, so there is the consensus amongst memory scholars that, you know, the past is always present. There is a book titled Present Past by Andreas Hewson. You know, people have written a lot about just, I think, I don't remember, I think it was William Faulkner who said that the past has not passed, you know. So there is that consensus about the past being present. But for me, the reason why I go for the term continuous past is because in this post-colonial African context, you see that it's not just that the past is present. Yes, it is present, but also there is something about the past also rolling into the future.
One of the themes that you highlight is the process of mourning, and so the way in which victims, and whether it be people who've experienced violence, or as you've highlighted, people who've experienced kind of intergenerational trauma, people whose parents, you know, went through the specific violence, that mourning or the wake becomes this kind of important, something that you identified in the literature that you were studying. How do practices of mourning or that idea of mourning work?
So there is a lot of memory scholars, they're all saying that, okay, let's move beyond the trauma paradigm. You know, not all memories are traumatic. We can talk about, you know, memories of joy, memories of activism, because they feel that trauma defines a lot of the ways in which memory is thought about today, because not all fiction coming out of Africa are about trauma or war. You know, there's people are writing about, you know, science fiction and all of that. But the particular, you know, genre of fiction that I am looking at is what I call post-conflict fiction of memory. That is, you know, not works of fiction that deal with works of fiction that deal with this question of what it means to live in a post-conflict era. And I'm using post-conflict in quotes because that's also a very problematic term that needs to be, you know, deconstructed. But so I make an argument in the book that post-colonial narratives or post-conflict fiction of memory is a work of mourning. Right. The mourning paradigm in this book is because, not just because the characters that are represented in the novels are mourning, their losses, during the war. And so when it comes to mourning, I mean, if you want to go psychoanalytic or Freudian, there is the question of loss, right? And so you see a lot of, of these characters survivors and victims who are like mourning the losses, and those losses could be loss of loved ones during the war, loss of property, loss of sometimes even selfhood and all of those things. So you see all those characters, they're not just traumatized, but that they are mourning the complex, concrete and abstract losses that were incurred during the war. So for me, maybe what I bring to the conversation is to think about memory itself, as mourning, memory as being, with the dead, memory as bearing, fidelity to the dead, and yeah.
It's interesting that you're focusing on fiction. One of the courses I teach on human rights discourse, we look at memoir and autobiographical type writing. We look at testimony. We look at reports like Amnesty International. And even in that, there's one of the controversies or one of the kind of tensions is that there's this sense that victims of traumatic events aren't necessarily the best people to describe it because it's subjective, it's emotional. You've chosen to look at fiction, and I think in a lot of kind of human rights frameworks, fiction would be kind of shied away from probably because it isn't truth, or it seems not to be true, or to be factual, or to represent what actually happened. So why choose fiction? What does fiction allow us that these other modes maybe don't?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Non-fictional works, we assume that they provide us with facts about the past, but fiction tells us the truth, and that and when in post-conflict situations, we should be more, attuned to wanting to know the truth than wanting to know the facts, right. Because because truth is more resilient than fact. For me, the other thing that I find interesting about fiction, and that's why I use the word friction in my title, in an interesting way. It's a play on word how fiction represents friction, because fiction is capable of representing complexities. I mean, good fiction, maybe not all fiction, but fiction is capable of representing complexity. You talk about linearity of time in these, accounts, but most of the novels that I study, the time is not linear. It's episodic, it's non-chronological. So I think fiction has the capacity to give you the messiness to provide you the messiness of the past, and to show antagonistic memories and even agonistic memories. And the other thing is that memory itself is fictional, and this is an argument that neuroscientists and psychologists will tell you that our remembrance of the past, or to use this novel's title, our remembrance of things past, right, is always mediated, and you don't remember the past exactly the way it is. And sometimes also in your remembering, your personality is inflected in that memory. And so remembering itself, it can be fictional. I realized at the end of the day that it's not even the accuracy, historical accuracy that matters, but the truth, and also the affective, or what Adichie calls the emotional truth. Right. You can have a head knowledge of an event, but not not have the affective, knowledge of it. And there is a huge difference between. So historians they can tell you what happened in 1960 at so time, but they probably may not have any affective connection to that event that they're writing about. Fiction gives you some sort of narrative truth, emotional truth, affective truth, whatever truth you want to call it, and that's why I went that route.
Right. Where does your research now go?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, again, I am new to Canada, right? I've only been here for less than a year, and I really believe in the politics of location. Feminist scholars write a lot about how where we live shapes our subjectivity and the way we see the world, and also how the world sees us. So for me, this first book is a very African project. It's situated in Africa. I was in Africa when I did the research, even though I did a lot of the writing here, which is good because the distance, privilege of distance, also helps in writing. So my thinking is beginning to change because of that politics of location. So I'm beginning to think about African immigrants in North America, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly do I want to look at, in the African immigrant community in North America. I'm really interested in maybe also coming from the book I'm currently writing, the idea of a melancholic diaspora. What does it mean to be melancholic in a North American diasporic setting? But also, what is our role? For example, my role or my place or my relationship with, the settler colonial memory and history. What does it mean to, again, memory coming into it? What does it mean not just to immigrate into a country, but to immigrate into a country's past, to a country's memory? So these are, I haven't figured out how to do that, but these are questions that I have right now, and I want to pursue. Immediately I'm done with this book, I want to move.
You want to move on to something?
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining me in my garden today and having this conversation. I look forward to kind of more conversations about the ideas that you've just brought up. But thanks again.
Thank you very much, for agreeing to do this. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Great. Thanks.